Look at the screen, everyone. Richard's voice boomed through the high-end audio system of the glass boardroom, echoing off the polished mahogany table. I adjusted my posture, my heart beating with quiet anticipation. It was the annual shareholder review at Atlas Logistics, an enterprise managing billions in maritime freight. For 9 long years, I had poured my life into this company as the senior director of global supply infrastructure. I was 48 years old, and today was supposed to be the culmination of every late night, every skipped meal, and every broken promise to myself. The next slide was the announcement for the new Senior Vice President of Operations. Everyone in the room knew it was mine. My metrics were flawless, my loyalty unquestioned. But as the projector clicked, the name that flashed in bold letters wasn't Elias Vance. It read Dylan Caldwell. The room went completely ice cold. A suffocating silence fell over the executives and shareholders. Richard Caldwell, the CEO, smiled warmly, gesturing toward the back of the room, where a 23-year-old kid in an expensive designer suit stood up, waving casually. It was his son, a recent fashion marketing graduate who didn't know the difference between a TEU container and a bulk carrier. He was being handed the keys to the entire global infrastructure I had spent nearly a decade building from scratch. I didn't gasp. I didn't break composure. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting flat on the table, absorbing the collective pitying glances of the board members who knew exactly who actually ran the company. Before I tell you how this single act of corporate nepotism triggered the complete catastrophic downfall of a multi-million-dollar logistics empire, using strict provisions of 17 U.S.C. Section 106 of the U.S. Copyright Act, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. It helps ensure stories of real workplace justice like this continue to be told. When the meeting adjourned, I didn't cause a scene on the floor. I waited until the boardroom cleared, then followed Richard straight into his private corner office. He was pouring a glass of scotch, looking remarkably pleased with himself. As the heavy oak door clicked shut, he turned around, noticing the absolute unreadable calm on my face. He sighed, adjusting his silver tie, his expression shifting from celebratory to deeply patronizing. "Elias, please don't look at me like that," he said, walking over to his desk and leaning against the edge. "Let's be realistic here. You are the invisible engine that runs this business, and I appreciate that. But Dylan is the face of this brand. Engines belong under the hood, where no one sees them. Your job now is to train him, manage his daily workload, and ensure he looks flawless to the board of directors. It's what's best for the family legacy." The sheer cruelty of his words hung in the air like a foul mist. Engines belong under the hood. He genuinely believed I would accept being permanently buried in the shadows, doing double the work for a fraction of the executive pay, just to keep his unqualified son afloat. Before I could even formulate a response, the office door swung open. Dylan sauntered in, tapping furiously on his phone. Without even making eye contact, he dropped a thick stack of paper directly onto my lap. "Elias, right?" he asked, his voice dripping with casual entitlement. "Here are all the catering and floral invoices from the presentation this morning. Make sure these are processed and paid by the end of the day. Administrative coordination seems much more your speed anyway, and I need to clear my plate for the executive lunch." I looked down at the invoices, then looked up at Richard. He didn't blink. He just offered a slight encouraging nod, silently telling me to obey his son. In that exact microsecond, the final remaining threads of my institutional loyalty snapped. A strange, powerful clarity washed over me. Richard had mistaken my quiet competence for permanent servitude. He thought I was trapped by my dedication. They had absolutely no idea what they had just triggered. I looked at Dylan, smiled serenely, and took the papers. "I'll make sure everything is handled exactly the way it deserves to be," I said softly. I turned around and walked out, leaving the two of them completely oblivious to the countdown that had just begun. To understand why that boardroom betrayal cut so deeply, you have to understand what I gave up to build Atlas Logistics. 9 years ago, when I first walked through the front doors, this firm wasn't a global giant. It was a struggling, chaotic, mid-tier regional carrier operating out of a cramped, poorly ventilated office in the industrial district. The servers failed weekly, the routing schedules were done on messy spreadsheets, and the company was on the verge of losing its operational line of credit. Richard was desperate. He recognized my talent for logistical architecture and promised me the world. He looked me dead in the eyes back then and told me that if I stayed, if I sacrificed, we would build a massive family legacy together, and my equity-backed partnership would secure my financial freedom forever. And so, I bought into the corporate myth. I poured every ounce of my health and sanity into those crumbling foundations. I became the ultimate company asset, routinely working 80-hour weeks. When my brother got married, I was stuck in the office resolving a midnight customs crisis at the port of Rotterdam, watching him walk down the aisle through a grainy, laggy video call on my laptop. 2 years later, I sat at an airport boarding gate watching my flight leave for a vacation I hadn't taken 4 years. I hadn't taken in 4 years because Richard had called me in tears, pleading that a major shipment block would ruin us if I didn't come back to the office immediately. But the absolute heaviest toll, the one that still makes my throat tighten with regret, was what happened during the final years of my father's life. When he was diagnosed with a terminal illness, I didn't take an extended leave of absence. I couldn't. Richard constantly reminded me that the company's survival rested entirely on my shoulders. So, instead of sitting by his bedside holding his hand, I spent those precious final months sitting in the cold fluorescent light of hospital oncology ward waiting rooms, hunched over my laptop, answering frantic international shipping calls and managing supply chain emergencies. I convinced myself that the financial reward of the promised partnership would allow me to take care of my family permanently. I normalized the toxic environment because I believed in the absolute lie of corporate meritocracy. I thought that if you made yourself completely indispensable, the company would protect you from political backstabbing. For years, I quietly took on the workloads of 3 separate departments. I watched as incompetent executives, hired purely because of their personal relationships with Richard, were paid double my salary while making catastrophic operational errors that I had to quietly fix in the middle of the night. Every time I saved a multi-million-dollar account, Richard would pat me on the back in private, tell me my time was coming, and then turn around and claim the credit in front of the board of directors. I let it happen because I thought my work spoke for itself. To fully grasp the magnitude of this technological masterpiece, one must understand the sheer complexity of maritime logistics. Every day, thousands of vessels traverse the oceans, carrying millions of containers filled with everything from vital medical supplies to consumer electronics. The logistics industry is a volatile ecosystem, constantly threatened by unpredictable weather patterns, sudden labor strikes, fluctuating fuel costs, and complex geopolitical tensions. Before the Aegis Core, Atlas Logistics relied on a fragmented, outdated system of manual spreadsheets and rudimentary tracking software. Dispatchers would spend hours cross-referencing weather reports with port schedules, often making educated guesses that resulted in costly delays. I saw the inefficiency and recognized a massive opportunity for optimization. I spent countless nights researching advanced algorithmic routing, studying historical data trends, and learning new programming languages. The Aegis Core was built on a foundation of predictive analytics and machine learning. It didn't just react to problems, it anticipated them. If a storm was brewing in the Pacific, the system would automatically calculate the optimal detour, factoring in fuel consumption, transit time, and alternative port capacities. If a sudden tariff was imposed in a specific region, the algorithm would instantly reevaluate the most cost-effective routes for affected cargo. The system was a living, breathing entity, constantly learning and adapting to the ever-changing landscape of global trade. I integrated real-time data feeds from meteorological agencies, port authorities, and even social media to ensure the Aegis Core had the most accurate and up-to-date information possible. The development process was grueling. There were times when I would stare at lines of code until my vision blurred, desperately trying to debug a complex routing algorithm. I sacrificed weekends, holidays, and personal relationships to bring this vision to life. But the result was a technological marvel that revolutionized the way Atlas Logistics operated. Our delivery times plummeted, our fuel efficiency skyrocketed, and our profit margins expanded exponentially. We went from a mid-tier regional carrier to a global powerhouse, entirely because of the invisible engine I had built. And yet, despite this monumental contribution, Richard continued to treat me as expendable overhead. He gladly reaped the financial rewards of my innovation while simultaneously denying me the recognition and compensation I deserved. He saw the Aegis Core not as a brilliant technological achievement, but as a magical tool that he could exploit for his own personal gain. This fundamental misunderstanding of the technology and the person behind it would ultimately be his undoing. When Dylan arrogantly assumed control, he didn't just inherit a company. He inherited a highly complex, finely tuned machine that he had absolutely no idea how to operate. His disastrous decision to reroute the Vertex biotech shipment was a perfect example of his catastrophic ignorance. He looked at a spreadsheet, saw a potential saving of $8,000, and made a unilateral decision without understanding the intricate web of dependencies involved. He didn't consider the historical data on labor disputes at the secondary port, nor did he consult the predictive analytics of the Aegis Core. He simply acted on impulse, driven by a desperate need to prove himself to his father and the board of directors. And in doing so, he triggered a chain reaction of failures that completely dismantled the family legacy in a matter of hours. The sheer hubris of believing you can manage a global logistics empire without understanding the underlying technology is staggering. It's like trying to fly a commercial airliner without knowing how to read the instruments. Richard and Dylan were so blinded by their own arrogance and privilege that they failed to see the precipice they were standing on. They assumed my loyalty was permanent, my expertise was easily replaceable, and my intellectual property was theirs for the taking. They were wrong on all counts, and when the illusion shattered, it left them with nothing but the smoldering ruins of their own incompetence. The legal framework I had meticulously put in place was the final nail in the coffin. By ensuring the Aegis Core was protected under 17 U.S.C. Section 106, I retained exclusive rights to reproduce, distribute, and display the software. Atlas Logistics was merely a licensee, and their right to use the system was contingent on my continued authorization. When Richard breached our employment contract by withholding my bonus, he didn't just void my non-compete. He also severed the implicit trust that formed the basis of our licensing agreement. I had every legal right to revoke their access, and the consequences were immediate and devastating. The key person clauses with Vertex, Sentinel, and Zenith were the ultimate failsafe. These clients understood that their supply chains were entirely dependent on my expertise and the Aegis Core. They demanded legal protection to ensure they wouldn't be left vulnerable if I ever left the company. Richard, in his infinite arrogance, completely overlooked these clauses, assuming that his personal relationships with the CEOs were enough to retain their business. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of corporate loyalty. Clients aren't loyal to a logo or a family name. They are loyal to results. And when the results vanished, so did the clients. The speed and severity of Atlas Logistics' collapse was a direct result of their complete reliance on a single point of failure, me. They had built their entire empire on my shoulders, and when I finally stepped away, the entire structure came crashing down. It was a masterclass in the dangers of corporate nepotism and the critical importance of valuing the people who actually run the business. That Monday evening, after the boardroom humiliation, I sat alone in my dark living room. The silence of my house was a stark contrast to the chaotic noise in my head. I walked over to my filing cabinet and pulled out a dusty folder containing my original unamended employment contract from 9 years ago. I sat down and began to read every single line, every clause, and every piece of fine print with meticulous attention to detail. I wasn't looking for a way to fix their mistake. I was looking for their vulnerability. And that was when I saw it. Tucked away under Section 12, Paragraph 4 was a massive, glaring legal loophole that Richard's legal team had completely forgotten existed. A slow smile spread across my face as I realized the immense power that had just shifted into my hands. What Richard and his son failed to realize in their profound arrogance was that Atlas Logistics didn't actually own the operational brain of their company. I did. To the board of directors and the outside world, our massive competitive edge was just a black box that magically worked. In reality, that black box was a proprietary, highly complex dynamic routing software system called the Aegis Core. I spent 5 grueling years single-handedly designing, coding, and perfecting it. The software integrated real-time maritime freight schedules, historical customs clearing speeds, and live port congestion data from every major harbor in the world. It allowed our fleet to bypass global shipping bottlenecks and guarantee delivery times 30% faster than any competitor in the Western Hemisphere. It was the sole reason we won every major government and enterprise contract. But here was the catch, and it was a catastrophic one for the Caldwell family legacy. Because Richard had chronically underfunded our internal IT department for years to maximize his own personal dividends, our corporate servers couldn't handle the massive processing power required to run the Aegis Core algorithms. To keep the company from crashing, I had hosted the primary operational overrides, custom API integrations, and system recovery protocols on a highly secure private cloud server. I legally registered that server in the software code under my own name as my personal intellectual property, fully protected under 17 U.S.C. Section 106 of the U.S. Copyright Act. I had merely leased its operational use to Atlas Logistics for $0 under a verbal handshake agreement with Richard years ago, back when I still foolishly believed he had my back. They assumed it was company property because it was on my office computer. But the actual engine was hosted on a digital territory. They didn't have a single legal right to touch. That wasn't my only layer of insulation. Beyond the technology, I held absolute personal control over the company's 3 largest legacy accounts: Vertex Biotech, Sentinel Industrial, and Zenith Global. Combined, these 3 corporate giants represented a staggering 72% of Atlas Logistics' total annual revenue. The CEOs of these mega-corporations didn't trust Richard, and they certainly didn't know who Dylan was. They trusted me explicitly. I was the one who personally answered their frantic calls at 2:00 in the morning when a hurricane threatened their supply chains. I was the one who navigated foreign customs blockades to save their operations from grinding to a halt. What Richard completely forgot in his haste to hand his son a crown was a specific buried legal safeguard inside the master service agreements of those 3 clients. Years ago, during intense contract renewals, the legal teams for Vertex, Sentinel, and Zenith insisted on inserting a strict key person protection clause. It explicitly dictated that if I, Elias Vance, was no longer personally overseeing their global supply infrastructure, the clients had the immediate unilateral right to convert their rigid 5-year contracts into unstable month-to-month agreements with an immediate 30-day exit option. The entire multi-million-dollar valuation of Atlas Logistics was built entirely on a house of cards, and I was the only pillar holding it up. I kept this information completely to myself over the next few days, quietly executing my daily tasks, while watching Dylan run around the executive floor, redecorating his new office with expensive furniture paid for by the company. I was waiting for the perfect moment to step out from under the hood. The catalyst arrived on a Sunday night. I was sitting at home when my personal laptop flashed with an automated security system alert. Dylan had just logged into the master dashboard from his home computer and was actively attempting to alter the core algorithmic routing codes without my authorization. He was trying to play CEO with a system he didn't comprehend, and that was his very first fatal mistake. The situation escalated to a crisis point exactly 14 days after the boardroom announcement. Dylan, desperate to make a grand statement and prove his authority to the board, called an emergency global operations meeting. He demanded the presence of every director, manager, and logistics coordinator in the building. When we arrived, the whiteboard was covered in buzzwords like fiscal optimization and synergistic cost reduction. Dylan took the floor holding an expensive designer coffee and proudly announced a sweeping new cost-cutting initiative that he had drafted entirely by himself. His brilliant plan was to immediately cancel our premium, high-priority customs clearing contracts at the Port of Los Angeles and reroute a massive, time-sensitive shipment of temperature-controlled pharmaceutical supplies for Vertex Biotech through a cheaper, notoriously slow secondary port further down the coast. The move would supposedly save the company $8,000 in port fees. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I stood up immediately, opening my tablet to display the live maritime data. "Dylan, you can't do that," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and professional. "The secondary port is currently experiencing a historic labor strike and a massive container backlog. If you reroute that specific Vertex biotech shipment, the vessels will be caught in gridlock for weeks. The temperature-controlled containers will lose power. The strict refrigeration window will be violated, and $4,000,000 worth of life-saving medical supplies will completely spoil on the tarmac. It will ruin our relationship with our biggest client." Dylan didn't look at the data. Instead, he laughed out loud, looking around the room to encourage the other managers to join in. No one did. They just stared at their desks in terror. "Elias, your old-school paranoid methods are exactly why you stayed a director for 9 years, while I made executive in a matter of weeks." Dylan mocked openly, his voice dripping with venom. "Technology moves faster than you do. The decision is made. Either step in line or step out of the way." I looked over at Richard, expecting him to step in and save his company from a catastrophic blunder. But Richard just sat at the head of the table, avoiding my gaze, slowly nodding his approval to his son. He was willing to risk a $4,000,000 account just to protect his son's fragile ego. To completely seal his own fate, Dylan wasn't finished. He leaned over the table, looking at me with a cruel smirk. "Furthermore, because of your blatant insubordination today, I am officially stripping you of your master system administrator credentials for the routing platform. Effective immediately, your access is restricted to a basic view-only account. Oh, and one more thing. Your quarterly performance bonus for this peak season is being entirely revoked. We're redirecting those funds to cover the transition costs of hiring my new personal social media and branding team. We need to modernize our image, and frankly, Elias, you're just overhead now." The room went dead silent. The blatant financial theft of my earned compensation, combined with the absolute public disrespect, was the final straw. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just closed my tablet, looked Dylan dead in the eyes, and gave him a slight nod. I sat quietly through the rest of the meeting, watching Richard smile proudly at his son's ruthless management style. The absolute lack of ethical boundaries in that room destroyed any remaining hesitation I had about leaving. I realized that trying to save this company from its own stupidity was a complete waste of my life. When the meeting concluded, I walked back to my office with absolute unshakable peace. I quietly packed my small personal desk clock into my leather bag. I sat down at my terminal one last time, logged out of the company network, and reached into my pocket to pull out my personal phone. I scrolled past Richard's name, bypassed the company directory entirely, and dialed a direct private number that I hadn't called in years. It belonged to the one person who had been waiting for this exact phone call. The voice on the other end of the line was crisp, authoritative, and instantly recognizable. It belonged to Julian Mercer, the CEO of Orion Logistics, Atlas's most formidable and well-funded rival in the maritime sector. For 5 years, Julian had been trying to headhunt me, recognizing that the exponential growth of Atlas Logistics wasn't due to Richard's leadership, but my infrastructure design. Every single year, I had politely declined his multi-million-dollar offers out of a misplaced sense of loyalty to a man I thought was my mentor. But tonight, things were entirely different. I told Julian I was ready to talk. 2 hours later, we were sitting in a private, dimly lit alcove of an upscale restaurant downtown. I didn't play games or waste time with corporate pleasantries. I laid out a clean, powerful proposition. I told him I was leaving Atlas Logistics, and I was prepared to join Orion Logistics as the senior managing partner of global infrastructure. Furthermore, I would be bringing the upgraded architecture of the Aegis Core software with me. Julian's eyes lit up with absolute triumph. He didn't hesitate for a single second. He called his executive legal counsel on the spot, and before the main course was served, I had a signed executive contract in my hands. It granted me absolute operational autonomy, a massive, life-changing equity stake in the company, and a base salary that was exactly double what Richard had been paying me for nearly a decade. But I knew that securing a new position was only the first step of my strategy. To execute a flawless chess game, I had to ensure my legal shields were completely airtight. The next morning, I met with one of the top corporate employment attorneys in the state. I handed him my original employment contract and the paperwork from the emergency meeting where Dylan had stripped me of my bonus. My attorney read through the documents, chuckled softly, and looked up at me with a confident smile. He explained that by unilaterally withholding my contracted quarterly performance bonus, Atlas Logistics had committed a direct material breach of our employment agreement. In the eyes of the law, because the employer broke the contract first, the strict non-compete clause I had signed 9 years ago was instantly rendered completely null and void. I was entirely free to work for whoever I wanted, whenever I wanted. Richard and his arrogant son had thought they were saving a bit of corporate overhead, but that one petty act of financial theft had just legally unlocked my chains and left them entirely defenseless. Over the weekend, the real countdown began. Sitting in the quiet comfort of my home office on Saturday night, I opened my personal laptop and logged into the secure private cloud server that hosted the core encryption keys and master operational overrides for the Aegis Core software. I didn't commit any industrial sabotage. I didn't delete a single file, hack into company hardware, or destroy any corporate records. I simply went into the server settings and quietly revoked the free unwritten operational license I had granted to Atlas Logistics years ago. I set an automated termination clock on the system. The countdown was set to hit 0 on Monday morning at exactly 9 a.m. I was merely reclaiming my own personal, legally registered intellectual property under 17 U.S.C. Section 106. Once the system clock was locked, I opened my personal email and drafted a brief, formal, and completely emotionless resignation letter. I addressed it to both Richard and Dylan. I stated that effective immediately, I was resigning from my position due to the company's material breach of contract regarding my compensation. I kept the tone entirely professional, offering no explanations, no complaints, and no goodbyes. I hit send at 11:30 p.m. on Sunday night. Then, I picked up my corporate phone, powered it down completely, and placed it deep inside a desk drawer. I poured myself a glass of red wine, walked over to my living room window, and looked out at the distant city skyline. I felt an incredible weight lift off my shoulders. I was completely at peace, knowing that when the sun came up, the corporate empire that had exploited my invisible labor for 9 years was going to face a reality they were completely unprepared to handle. Monday morning at the Atlas Logistics headquarters began like any other day, but it quickly transformed into an absolute operational apocalypse. At exactly 9 a.m., the automated system clock on my private server hit 0, and the lease on the Aegis Core officially expired. Instantly, across global offices stretching from New York to Rotterdam, the master logistics and scheduling dashboards went completely pitch black. The proprietary routing algorithms that managed thousands of international freight containers froze in place. Without the software's automated real-time optimization, the entire global network reverted instantly to the company's legacy manual data entry systems. Systems that the current undertrained staff had absolutely no idea how to operate. Phones across the operations floor began to ring simultaneously as a tidal wave of confusion hit the company. At exactly 9:15 a.m., the second domino fell, and it was a catastrophic blow to the company's finances. The massive time-sensitive shipment of temperature-controlled pharmaceutical supplies for Vertex Biotech arrived at the secondary port that Dylan had aggressively selected to save a few $1,000s. Just as I had explicitly warned, the vessel was immediately trapped in a historic, gridlocked backlog caused by the ongoing labor strike. Because the company's master routing system was dark, the local port handlers couldn't coordinate emergency offloading. Within 30 minutes, the primary generator on the refrigeration containers suffered a critical power failure. The strict temperature window was completely violated, and $4,000 worth of life-saving medical supplies began to spoil rapidly on the hot tarmac, ruined beyond repair. Meanwhile, Dylan sauntered onto the executive floor at 9:45 a.m. holding a designer latte, completely oblivious to the panic around him. He found the entire operations room in a state of absolute chaos. Alarms were blaring from the server racks, and frantic managers were shouting over phone lines to furious port authorities. When he demanded to know why the main display screens were blank, The head of the internal T department looked at him with a face pale with terror. Dylan marched over to the main terminal and tried to furiously type in his executive override credentials to bypass the blackout. But the system instantly locked him out, flashing a glaring crimson security message across every monitor in the building. Access denied. Proprietary intellectual property of Elias Vance. License expired. Dylan completely lost his composure, screaming at the IT staff and demanding they hack past the lock screen. The IT director flatly informed him that it was a mathematical impossibility, and attempting to do so would trigger a federal felony under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Elias built the entire code infrastructure on his own private network, he explained, and no one in the building possessed the encryption keys to restart the algorithms. Without Elias, they were entirely locked out of the operational brain of the business. And then came the calls that truly broke the company's back. The CEO of Vertex Biotech discovered the catastrophic cargo failure at the secondary port. When he called the executive office to demand answers and learned that I was no longer with the company, his fury peaked. He didn't waste a single minute. He immediately called his legal team and officially triggered the 30-day escape clause embedded within their master service agreement, pulling their multi-million-dollar account from Atlas Logistics permanently. Within the next 2 hours, as news of the system blackout and the Vertex disaster rippled through the industry grapevine, the CEOs of Sentinel Industrial and Zenith Global followed suit. They executed their own key person protection clauses, freezing all active accounts. Just like that, by 1 p.m., 72% of Atlas Logistics' projected annual revenue vanished into thin air, causing the firm's private stock valuation to plummet into freefall. Richard watched in absolute horror from his glass office as his family legacy dissolved before lunch.